Good Sunday morning and welcome to the latest edition of At Issue. I'm Corey Smith.
I'm Sue O'Connell. 2 words for you this morning: ballot questions. We're going to try and arm you with all the information that you need in order to cast smart votes on 5 important topics.
Plus, chances are this election season you've read or heard stories about Latino voters, which sometimes involves an effort to diagnose which issues are important to that voting bloc and why. Well, the Boston Globe's Esme Jimenez is here to help us understand this often overlooked group of eligible voters.
But first, a quick look back at what was at issue over the past week.
Well, the man arrested in the second assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump made his first appearance in court today. The Secret Service says he did not have a line of sight of Donald Trump and never fired his weapon during yesterday's incident.
Microsoft says Russian disinformation actors have been targeting the Harris Walls campaign with fake videos since last month.
The Federal Reserve announced it will be cutting interest rates for the first time since March of 2020.
For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters will not endorse a presidential candidate.
The Senate has voted to hold the CEO of Stewart Healthcare in contempt of Congress.
This has been an ongoing story now, and the vote comes after Ralph De La Torre refused to attend a Senate panel hearing last week.
Massachusetts is getting ready to mark 250 years since the start of the Revolutionary War. So this morning you could see leaders gathered at the State House to kick off Massachusetts 250.
The governor seemed up to the challenge, mounting horse with a group of British regulars on Beacon Street.
The governor on horseback.
Oh,
you would have thought. All right, love them or hate them, ballot questions are back on the ballot in Massachusetts. Election day is in a little more than 6 weeks, but early voting here begins in just over 3 weeks.
And there are 5 binding ballot questions on 5 different topics. Now, all of us need a little extra help from an expert to learn about these questions, so we have a guest who has studied them closely.
Evan Horowitz is the executive director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts University Tisch College. Thank you so much for joining us on At Issue.
Oh, it's great to be here.
We appreciate it. Your group has a report or a guide, if you will, for voters that we highly recommend. It certainly helped.
All five questions.
For all 5 questions. It certainly helped us craft some of the questions that we have for you today. So we're going to get you to walk us through all of these very important questions for voters. Let's start with question 1. It has to do with the state auditor's authority to audit the legislature. Now, this was central to current state auditor Diana DeZoglio's election campaign. A yes vote would expand the auditor's investigative powers, allowing the office to oversee the legislature's departments, activities, programs. A no vote would oppose giving the auditor that authority. And I believe we have some sound that we can play about this issue.
We the people deserve access.
We do an independent audit on ourselves. We hire a company, we put it up online. These things are already being done.
So, Evan, if this is passed, which or what legislative activities would the auditor have the expanded powers to oversee, and which ones would be off limits?
I mean, there's a legal answer to this and a practical answer.
Right.
The practical answer is probably none. Like, the most likely outcome of this, even if it passes, is that the auditor does not really earn any new power to oversee the legislature. There are a couple of reasons for that. Part of it is constitutional separation of powers. She is an executive branch agent. She has lots of authority over executive branch departments and agencies. She doesn't have any authority over core legislative activities like how they set up committees, how votes work. She's never going to be able, the courts will never let her touch those. There are a few areas where she might get some, like procurement processes. You know, they have to buy desk chairs in the legislature. Mm-hmm. She might be able to audit the question like, are they following best practices when they purchase desk chairs? But guess what? The legislature is probably not going to comply. So even there, it's pretty doubtful she's going to be able to exercise any new authority that the voters give her.
Do you foresee this compared to other states? I mean, are there states, when you compare them, that are doing this? I mean,
there are states that have an auditor that works on audits with their legislature. We spoke to people in a variety of states. We did not find any examples of any states where an auditor undertakes an audit of the state legislature without consent from the legislature. It doesn't happen. It's really unlikely to happen here.
All right, let's go on to question 2. This one focuses on the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, better known as MCAS. Yes vote eliminates the requirement that students pass the MCAS in order to graduate high school. No vote would make no change in graduation requirements. Let's listen to both sides on this.
Does not seek to eliminate the MCAS. This simply seeks to eliminate the high stakes, punitive rank and shame nature.
We are literally asking students to meet a 10th grade standard in order to graduate by 12th grade.
So this debate has been raging for years. The Mass Teachers Association proposed the question. They're funding the campaign for yes. A number of business groups, education reformers are backing the no vote. What did you guys find when you analyze this question?
This is a more traditional kind of setup. You have the union on one side, you have business interests. It's a question of kind of state authority. But I think the best way to think about it really is a kind of state versus local question. Right now, if you're a student, you graduate from public high school, you have to prove yourself to your district, and you also have to prove yourself to the state. If this question passes, you won't have to prove yourself to the state anymore. The districts will control the graduation standards. Now, there are over 300 districts, so we're talking about the potential for a lot of fragmentation. And it's one reason that you see a lot of state officials who've come out in opposition to this. You know, the governor has come out, and she's not the only one. So probably for voters, that's really the right way to think about it. What role should the state have in setting a common floor, a common set of standards for high school graduation, if any?
So what are teachers saying about this?
Teachers are saying they would have a lot more freedom to teach to the needs of their students if they didn't have to worry about getting them through the MCAS. And I think the response is, no, it's okay to get them through the MCAS because the MCAS is full of stuff we want them to learn. And if they're not learning that stuff, we've got bigger problems.
But they also make the argument there are certain students who they feel are being left behind by the MCAS, and not having the MCAS would help them. Who are they?
For sure, there are students, particularly students with cognitive disabilities and students who are coming into this country without knowing English and just learning English. For those students, it is really hard to get to the MCAS. Remember, one of the MCAS tests is an English test. So if you're not a fluent English speaker, it's really hard to pass a high school level English test. And if you can't do that, it's harder to graduate. Now, the state does have some workarounds. There are ways for these students to still get their graduation, but it's certainly harder for those students.
How many of those students graduate without taking the MCAS?
A fair number, actually. So when we look at the numbers, it's about 700 kids per year who meet their district requirements but don't pass the MCAS. That's about 1% of students. So we're talking about a really small number of kids who are not able to graduate because they can't get through the MCAS, and they tend to have other problems. You say they have those. They have absenteeism problems. They have it's not clear that the direct stakes of this really matter. We're talking about a small number of kids who are affected, but then there are the extended stakes, which involve, well, would this really free up teacher time? Would they be able to focus on different things? Or would it turn us into the kind of state where we have 300 different districts with separate graduation standards and a weakening education system?
So that is why you hear maybe some state officials say, no, we shouldn't have this sort of framework all over the Bay State. What about the business community? What are they saying about this?
I think that's their concern also, is they want skilled workers. They know that skilled workers come from a solid education system. We've spent 3 decades building up one of the best education systems in the country. Why are we messing with it? And if we do mess with it, is it going to affect their ability to hire good people in state?
All right, let's move on to question 3. This one asks whether transportation network drivers, the men and women who drive for Uber and Lyft, should be allowed to unionize. A yes vote on this question would provide these drivers the option to form unions to collectively bargain with transportation network companies over wages, benefits, and more. No vote keeps the status quo relative to the ability of transportation networks drivers to form unions. We mentioned Uber and Lyft drivers. They are obviously at the core of this question, but what about all those food delivery drivers, those gig workers? They involved in this at all?
Not yet. Okay. They do not count for the purposes of question 3, but there's some precedent setting here, right? If this passes, if we do become the first state to establish a whole new mechanism, that's what it is, a whole new mechanism to unionize gig workers, then for sure the next step will be, well, maybe not just Uber and Lyft drivers, maybe the delivery drivers, also other states. So this could be the beginning of a whole new paradigm for unionizing gig workers.
So you called this sector-based bargaining in that it impacts workers from multiple companies working in this sector. Any other industries that are directly going to be impacted by this now?
So not immediately, but I think that's why you're going to see a lot of opposition. So usually in this country, if you're an employee, you create a union and then you bargain with your employer. It's like, I work for Uber, I'm going to bargain with Uber or General Electric, whatever it is. But drivers are not considered employees. They're considered independent contractors, so they can't form that kind of union. So what the question would do is it sets up this whole new regulatory scheme for drivers to bargain as a sector. So Uber and Lyft drivers, they come together. They are on one side of the table. On the other side of the table are both companies working together, and any other rideshare companies. And they would set rules for everybody, not just for one company, but for the whole industry. And as I say, for now, it would only apply to those drivers, but it's a first-in-the-nation kind of effort, and if it passes, yeah, you're likely to see it in other industries. You're almost certain to see it in other states. That's one reason we expect to see some pretty severe pushback from business interests, not beyond the rideshare industry.
So I'm a one-car family with 2 people. I use Uber and Lyft a lot. How's that going to impact me? What would the results of this be?
Well, the drivers who take you places are going to get paid more, most likely if they form a union. So that's one thing. But it means some of that additional cost is going to get passed on to you. So you're likely to see higher costs for your rides and probably some reduced availability.
All right.
All right, go ahead.
You want to move on to the next question?
Yes, this is my favorite question.
You want to take it?
Yes.
Go ahead.
All right, so question 4 deals with the legalization and regulation of psychedelic drugs. A yes vote would allow people 21 and older to use certain natural psychedelic substances under licensed supervision, as well as grow limited quantities of those substances in their home, and it would create a commission to regulate those substances. A no vote would make no changes to the law. Where did this question come from?
Yeah, what's up with this?
Yeah, this is not one of those that's like, oh, we've been talking about this for 3 decades, like MCAS forever. It's been one of the things we argue about. Nobody's been talking about legalizing psychedelics. This comes from a group that's been working around the country to change the laws around psychedelics, state by state, find fertile ground. They identified Massachusetts as a place where we have some cities and towns that have decriminalized psychedelic drugs. And they thought, okay, let's build on that momentum. We'll go and we'll introduce the ballot question. That's where it came from. So this is very much an imported question, but it's going to matter. We are voting on it, and it does a few different things. When you mentioned, there are 2 parts of it, and it's best to kind of break it into 2 parts. There is a personal use part. If this passes, then people will be allowed to grow on their own a bunch of different psychedelic substances. It's not just mushrooms, like that's one of them, but it's also DMT, which is used in ayahuasca. It's also mescaline, which is in peyote. It's also psilocin, which is another kind of mushroom compound, and ibogaine, which is a very powerful root. You can grow it, you can share it, you can just give it away to anybody, not just friends and family. So there's a whole personal use side with almost no regulation. It just would be legal. And then over time, the state would create therapy centers where people could go, pay money, and have a controlled experience with any of these drugs and a facilitator.
What other states already have laws that are like this, decriminalization or allowance of at-home use?
So a number of states have decriminalization, but in terms of like a formal legalization program, Oregon has a program just for psilocybin. So they don't do any of the personal use stuff. It's just, you know what, we're going to set up some centers, and it's just for magic mushrooms. That's what we're doing. Colorado has one that's closer to what we're talking about, but a little narrower. It has the whole personal use side of things you can grow, although they make an exception. Ibogaine, I should mention, is a very powerful drug with some cardiac risks, and they will not allow you to share. So that one is exempted from sharing. We didn't do that. But they have this full decriminalization of the drugs, but they only set up their therapy centers for one drug, psilocybin. So we're the only state that would do all of these drugs in the therapy centers and full legalization and sharing of all these drugs.
Any data from how that?
I mean, so there haven't been any like major public health problems. You know, we talk to people in both those states, and that's one of the questions. Are you seeing, you know, people dying in the streets, or they're no. But we do know that a lot of these drugs have some pretty acute impacts on people. Healthy people, you know, who are using ayahuasca go through some serious neurological kind of challenges. But then people who have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, when they use these drugs, they can have some very damaging short and long-term effects.
So people will naturally compare this to the marijuana question. Obviously, at the time, marijuana is still illegal under federal law. There will be a commission to run it, as you mentioned, but under this plan, no retail store where I can go out and buy psychedelics?
No, you got to find a friend who's growing it or a stranger who's growing it, but there will not be retail stores where you can go and purchase it and bring it home. That's not going to happen. It is still illegal federally, so you have that same challenge where the feds could still come in and crack down and say, I know you legalized all of these drugs, but these drugs are illegal. Please stop allowing people to use them. It hasn't happened in Colorado. It hasn't happened in Oregon. But both of those were done under Democratic administrations. Who knows what the future of the presidency holds?
We'll see.
That's a different topic. We're not going to.
A whole different topic there. We'll have you back for that one. All right, let's get to question number 5. This is the economic question dealing with the minimum wage for tipped workers. A yes vote would increase the minimum hourly wage for an employer must pay a tipped worker to the full state minimum wage of $15 an hour, implemented over 5 years. And again, a no vote would make no change to the law.
Explain how minimum wage laws work.
Yeah.
I think you need a base understanding of that, especially for restaurant work.
I appreciate that because it's easy to think, oh, this is about raising the minimum wage. That's not what this is about. Tipped workers are already guaranteed the full minimum wage. They're going to earn at least $15 an hour, just like everybody else in Massachusetts. It's really just a question of who pays. The employer right now is allowed to pay as little as $6.75, so long as the worker gets the other $8.25 in tips. So the tips are covering part of the minimum wage, the employer's covering the other part. That's the current system. You already are guaranteed the wage, but who pays? If the ballot question passes, the employer will have to cover the full $15, and then you can get tips on top. But the big question is, like, what happens to those tips? What happens to people who come into restaurants and they know that their servers are getting $15 already? Are they going to keep tipping? Or, more likely, the restaurant knows it has to pay more, so it adds a service fee to the menu, or it raises prices. Do the diners then say, oh no, there's a service fee on here of 20%, I'm not going to tip on top of that? So that's where all the questions come. When you shift who's paying, what are the impacts?
Is there any data that says that this would actually increase wages for workers?
Yeah, so unlike the psychedelic questions, where we have like 1 year of data on 2 states, tipped wages have been with us for decades and decades. And so we can look at what happens when states remove them or raise them or lower them. And what you find is pretty durable increases in the earnings of tipped workers. So we find that if you're a restaurant worker or a manicurist, you're likely to see your earnings go up if this question passes. It's also true, however, that raising the tip minimum wage is hard on businesses. So businesses are going to have to compensate, and the way that they traditionally compensate, the research suggests, is by raising prices. It's going to be service fees, it's going to be higher menu prices. People are going to pay more in order to make sure that tip workers are earning more.
Over the last several years, we've seen you go out to a restaurant and on your bill it says that 3% service to allow our staff to make a living wage.
Or you get a bottle of water out of the freezer and it says...
Obviously, at the center of this, you think of those waiters, waitresses, hostesses, but there's cooks in the back of the house, there's dishwashers. How does this impact them?
And that's sort of part 2 of question 5. So the big question is, who's going to pay the $15? But then there's this sort of addendum that says, once restaurants are paying their workers the full minimum wage, the restaurants can take the tips, pool them, and share them with all non-managerial employees. So you can take those tips, share it with kitchen staff, but you could share it with your accountant, who is a non-managerial employee. So you can pool and distribute, and this has caused some chagrin among wait staff who nominally stand to benefit in terms of higher prices. They don't all relish the idea of sharing their tips. We all know sort of people who became bartenders, got into it. And partly it's because they like to hustle. They're good at working with people. They know how to pick up their tips. And the idea that they would then have to take those tips and share them with everybody else, it rankles.
All right. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today and educating us on each of these questions. If you want more information, you can read the guide for voters. We highly recommend it. The website is on your screen right now, cspa.tufts.edu. Evan, thanks so much.
That was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Happy voting. All right, coming up, a closer look at a block of voters who the presidential candidates are desperately trying to get support from.
Around this time in every presidential cycle, you hear about Latino voters and you hear a lot of half-truths or old myths. The Boston Globe's Esme Jimenez will join us to clear up some of those myths. Coming up, stay with us.
All right, the polls in the battleground states for the presidential race remain very close, and outreach to new voters in those states could decide the outcome.
And the fastest growing group of new voters are Latino Americans. Every 30 seconds, a Latino teenager turns 18, thereby becoming a potential voter.
So check it out. More than 36 million Latinos will be eligible to vote in this year's election, an increase of 4 million from 2020. That represents 50% of the total growth in eligible voters over the past 4 years. Now, when members of the media or pundits talk about Latino voters, generalizations and oversimplifications are aplenty. Latinos can be lumped together as a uniform group. Boston Globe senior reporter Esme Jimenez wrote about this recently in the Globe, and you see the headline right there, the underestimated, misunderstood, enormous voting power of Latino Americans. Esme joins us in studio. Thank you for joining us here on At Issue. You're right that political conversations about Latino voters become one-dimensional in part because of just how diverse the Latino population in the U.S. is, and in Massachusetts as well. What have you found out there when you're talking to voters, Latino voters specifically, about how they're being talked to by candidates, and when you talk to candidates, how they approach messaging to Latino voters?
Yeah, I think the truth of the matter is just that it's a lot more complicated than anyone wants to acknowledge. We say, Latino, Hispanic, that term didn't even exist until the 70s, right? That was very specifically because the federal government needed to call us something. But there's 21 different countries in Latin America. So that's lots of different kinds of people. We all have different ideas, different backgrounds, different religions. So I think when it comes to actually figuring out what is the Latino vote, it just means slowing down and really thinking through these different demographics, these different people, We're different across geography, gender, generations. So really, that's what I'm asking, that as media, we do a better job of covering and talking through those nuances.
I heard a pollster on a podcast, a well-known pollster, who's been doing it for a very long time, say a couple of weeks ago on a podcast, that many pollsters have finally figured out that when you say the Latino vote, it's like saying the white vote.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
It means nothing. You know, there are some constituencies that are directionally, women vote, black vote, LGBTQ vote. But even though they seem to know that now, you have found that half of Latino electorate in Nevada, which is a key battlestone state, they say they haven't even been contacted by a campaign or a political party. What's up with that?
Well, that's heartbreaking. But I think what's occurring is that some politicians or political parties, I think because they see it as so complex, they're like, we're just not going to bother with it. For example, one thing that I saw with the Harris campaign, they had a couple commercials that went out. They translated them into Spanish. Some Hispanic people saw that and were like, that's pandering, right? That's disrespectful. The majority of Latino Americans in the U.S. speak English. For others, they were like, no, I want my grandmother or my aunts to be able to understand this, so it's meaningful to them. And that's what I'm talking about. When you're talking about the Latino vote, it's quite complex.
We know these campaigns know how to target messages. I grew up in Texas, so I grew up around a very large Latino and Hispanic population and came to realize very quickly that they are very, very different. They live, they can live in the same neighborhood, but practice different religions, generational divides. Have you seen campaigns catch up with the fact that maybe the Latino vote in Florida is going to be different from the Latino vote in Texas and geographically across the country?
I think they're starting to get there. I really do. I think the initiative is good, but I still find myself every 4 years being like, we're not a monolith, and we're back to square one. And so I'd like to push further than that and say, we're a kaleidoscope, right? Let's actually analyze those different pockets. Let's think through that and then reach out to Latinos.
So the voting block is there in terms of sheer numbers. What about the participation?
Participation, that's also a heartbreaking point, and that's at about only half of Latinos that are eligible to vote actually cast that vote. And I think the things that I noticed about that were two things. One, when it comes to who actually is voting, it's deeply tied to education and income levels, right? Folks that have a higher education and higher income tend to actually cast their vote. For Latinos, unfortunately, that means that our education levels are a little bit lower, our income's a little bit lower, and I think that's kind of why that tracks that way.
One of the lucky things for me is that whenever I say something stupid, my colleagues at Telemundo correct me and help me and teach me. Is there an issue? I know that immigration means a number of different things to the Latino population, as we're saying. Is there an issue, though, that you can say is a top 3 issue for most Latinos or Hispanic folks?
Absolutely, and that's going to be the economy. Pew has done some research on this and found that it's really pocketbook issues that Latinos are thinking about. They're worried about their rent. They're worried about groceries. They're worrying about just the cost of living, much like every other voter right now.
So how do you think, do you think we will see turnout? Obviously with the Harris taking over for Biden, there's been that enthusiasm there. We do know that Trump is trying to message more towards Latino voters, which the Republican Party has been able to grow their numbers there. Do you think the participation will be there this cycle?
I think there's a very real possibility that the sleeping giant may finally move. But I think more importantly, the other thing is that if the campaigns now invest money and time in reaching Latino voters, if they can crack that code, they're not just securing this election, they're securing the elections 10 years, 20 years from today.
All right. Esby Jimenez, thank you so much for joining us here on At Issue. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you as the campaign winds down.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.
That is going to do it for this edition of At Issue. Next Sunday, we are joined by Congressman Seth Moulton to talk about the presidential race and his work to get more veterans elected to public office.
Plus, 50 years ago, the busing crisis ripped Boston apart. I spoke with 2 city leaders, Kim Janey and Michael Curry, who were young children and were witness to and targets of racist violence and threats. What they told me about that time and where they are now.
Thanks once again for joining us here on At Issue. I'm Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Have a great day.